Hey guys, today we're talking about the 1920s and the Jazz Age. So let's get right into it. You want the facts? I have them. Los Angeles of before 1900 was a small prohibitionist town until an influx of filmmakers occurred in the area. The varied weather and sizable workforce was mainly what lured them there. The size of the town increased vastly with the introduction of a main strip. Los Angeles became a world-famous city by the beginning of 1920. Before the 1920s, America was deeply separated in cultural regions due to the lack of inter-regional travel and communication. The introduction of movies, improved news collection, and radio broadcasts kickstarted the formation of a nationwide culture. Though films were well-liked since their inception, the decades between 1910 and 1930 saw a massive increase in film attendees and theaters. Nearly 90 million Americans were watching films every week, which made up a majority of the United States population. Movies soared to become the fourth most profitable profession even when they were all silent before the year 1927. The movie The Jazz Singer, starring Al Jolson, was the first ever film with sound. The medium of newspapers evolved greatly after 1900. Average newspapers increased their page count from a measly 14 to a total of 50 pages by the mid-1920s. The utilization of newsprint in America almost doubled. Many smaller magazines and newspaper companies were bought up in an attempt to form vast chains. Publisher of the New York Journal and San Francisco Examiner, Will R. Hearst, owned a chain covering over 20 city newspapers. Sharing of the same news stories started a widespread American culture. Radio hardly had a national presence until 1920. Frank Conrad's experimental recordation of music and sports on radio led to the creation of the first profitable radio station, KDKA Pittsburgh. After 1922, there was an excess of 500 radio stations. The NBC was the first broadcasting service to associate several stations that played the same programs. Other companies began to follow suit. Substantial African American relocation to major cities in some nation with increased radio expansion led to the emergence of jazz music. Jazz was the musical coalition of ragtime and the blues. New Orleans-based acts started incorporating jazz into their music by 1900. 20 years later, the genre was being heard nationwide. 2/3 of radio stations were playing the music loved especially by the young generation. Many Americans who had at one time been appalled by jazz had their opinions slowly reversed. Harlem, which played host to over 500 jazz clubs, was revered for its collection of great performers. Clubs like the Cotton Club, Connie's Inn, and the Saratoga would only play to white Americans, though. Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and the Roll Morton Band were some of the influential players of these jazz clubs. Duke, or Edward Kennedy Ellington, born in 1899, was a son to a butler. He grew up living a middle-class lifestyle, which at the time was unusual for most African Americans. By the time he was 17, he was able to live off the income he generated by playing Washington-based clubs. Ellington was also a gifted painter. After being convinced by renowned musician Fats Weller, he moved to New York in order to start a band. He stayed with the band up until his death. He was a brilliant composer, pianist, and band leader. Over the span of his career, he wrote excess of 1,000 pieces. Jazz ran so deep in the cultural identity of the time that it started influencing mediums such as painting and poetry. Traditional composers started to blend jazz into their symphonic compositions. The famous Rhapsody in Blue, played by Paul Whiteman Orchestra, demonstrated this superbly. Due to the aforementioned expansion of the correlation between jazz and other mediums, painters started to use the oscillating rhythm of life in their works. Edward Hopper and Rockwell Kent began to paint scenes of the arduous American experience, such as mines, cities, bars, and hardened streets. Others, like Georgia O'Keeffe, used nature to express her feelings. Writing wasn't in any way left behind in the wake of other art forms. Writers like Sinclair Lewis criticized small towns, conformists, medical-based businesses, and dishonesty. Eugene O'Neill wrote many plays ranging from gloomy to tragic. He blazed a path for future American playwrights. One particular group, nicknamed the Lost Generation, held the belief that the world of the 1920s was vapid and heartless. They carried out their own private rebellions in the form of carrying out unorthodox lifestyles. Expatriates left the country to live in places like Paris. Famous expatriates included Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and John Dos Passos. Hemingway wrote simple classics, while Fitzgerald crafted The Great Gatsby, a criticism of the rich and powerful. Flappers adopted the morals of these great writers. Harlem in New York was home to 200,000 African Americans. Jazz and the African American literacy awakening led to the Harlem Renaissance. James Weldon Johnson was a leading Harlem-based writer. He was a secretary for the NAACP. Leading Harlem poets such as Claude McKay and Countee Cullen protested wrongdoings towards people of color and introduced the public to many African American works. Langston Hughes gave a vivid picture of what it was truly like to be African American through his collective volumes of poetry, short stories, journalism, and plays.